All right, we're getting ready with Daniel Golden, who is the author of Spy Schools, How the CIA, FBI, and Foreign Intelligence Services Secretly Exploit America's Universities. We're excited to talk with investigative journalist Daniel Golden. Are you with us?
I am, yes. Glad to be with you.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on to Freethinker Radio here on 90.1 KPFT Houston. This is a listener-supported corporate-free radio where we're able to talk about some of these topics here. Maybe some would say controversial topics, and we're happy to cover this and excited to hear more about what you've uncovered in your work. But before we get into that, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm a longtime investigative journalist, mostly focusing on higher education. So I've worked for the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and now I'm a senior editor at ProPublica, which is a sort of investigative outlet that has its own website and also partners with the Times and the Post and the New Yorker and other great publications. I won a Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for a Wall Street Journal series about how rich people essentially buy their kids' way into elite colleges by making big donations to universities. One of the people I focused on at the time was Jared Kushner, who, at the time I just noticed him because his father was a rich real estate guy and made a big contribution to Harvard to get his son in. Of course, now he's President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor. So I turned that series into a book called The Price of Admission. That's actually where Kushner is featured, The Price of Admission. And won another Pulitzer Prize and editor at Bloomberg on a topic that's in the news now, which is corporate inversions. Corporations moving operations overseas to make money, and now I, as I say, edit and write predominantly investigative on higher education, and this book is about the intersection of higher education and espionage.
Awesome. That's really important work, and it's interesting, that you focus on that specific area as far as education and all that entails. And now with the new book that we're covering today, Spy Schools, you're going into seeing how the intelligence services, both domestically here in the United States and abroad, are getting involved in campuses in a variety of ways. So let's start to get into that. What drew you to looking into this specifically, though, this area? I've seen that, this has been reported on different times by different journalists, various elements of some of the things you covered, and I think you uncovered probably much more than anybody had realized was really going on. But what first drew you to looking into this area?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I have found a lot more that hasn't been reported. And what got me into it was that I did a piece about a professor at the University of South Florida whose name was Dajin Pong. And he'd been born and bred in China, came to the U.S., was of interest to the FBI for various reasons. He had high-level connections in China, became a professor, as I say, at South Florida, and then got in trouble there for a variety of things, to porn on his computer. And basically the FBI went to him and they said, look, you can lose your professorship and go to prison for your financial transgressions, or you can keep your professorship. We'll make sure the university doesn't fire you as long as you spy on China for us. And at one point, they even asked the university to set up a branch in China as a base for his spying. So I wrote this story up. To me, it was, amazing and startling, but various insiders I talked to, when I asked them about it, they said, oh, this isn't really that uncommon. There's lots of people being pressured by U.S. intelligence services at universities and are approached. And I decided, to look into more of it. And, of course, I did find many more, previously unrevealed case studies of both foreign and domestic intelligence services intruding on campus.
So tell us a little bit about how that process goes. Like when we're talking about them getting involved in campuses, now is this directly, like, say, impersonating teachers? Like, are there CIA agents as professors out there, or are they on there trying to recruit for, their next generation of employees? Or what exactly is involved in this process?
Well, there's different kinds of recruiting, and of course the most innocent, which I have no problem with is just straight over recruiting on campus, where the CIA and the FBI go in and they hold a career fair, or some other event, and they say, come work for the CIA and FBI, and that's fine. And they're only allowed to hire U.S. citizens, so, that's kind of very above board. And then there's an immediate stage where they might want somebody to spy for them, maybe a professor or a researcher whose work takes them regularly overseas, or maybe somebody who's in communication with foreign scientists, and they have a cutting-edge specialty, and they say, can you provide us information? And again, that's a little more dicey, but at least they're saying they're the CIA, and they're explaining what they want to do. And then the third kind, which I focus on the most, is when they deal with foreign students and, researchers and professors. And there, if the person is not a U.S. citizen, they're not obliged to disclose who they are. So the CIA might well approach somebody who's unwitting. They might have a professor who they're friendly with, has a graduate student from Iran or China, and the professor might say to the student, I've got a friend who'd like to pay you to do some work for him or something, and then not say that the friend is from the CIA. So that's one way. One of my chapters is about the Harvard University's Kennedy School, which is the premier public policy graduate program in the country, and it nobody had ever made this public before, but what happens there is the CIA has officers enroll undercover in the Kennedy School's mid-career program, which is a program, it's mostly foreigners who would make very good intelligence assets. They're business people and government and military people on their way up to the top ranks in their countries. And, a CIA agent who had a stint abroad is between assignments, the CIA will send him to the Kennedy School. And, these mid-career programs are mostly, a lot of it is networking. So the CIA officers using as foreign cover, which is as a, State Department, Foreign Service officer, diplomat usually, and they get to know their foreign classmates who don't realize they're from the CIA, and they, go out for beers or whatever. And they're not supposed to formally recruit them while they're classmates, but then, when the year's over and the CIA agent goes back overseas, and so does the foreign mid-career student, they might become U.S. informants without ever really knowing that they're helping the CIA. So that's an example of a little less, a little more covert approaches. So I look at them all. And from the foreign standpoint, with globalization, we've got more than 1 million foreign students here and hundreds of thousands of foreign professors and researchers. And, some small but intriguing percentage of them are here to, gather information for their country, maybe get to know influential professors, maybe find out what kind of cutting-edge research we're doing in the sciences. And so, both sides, as I say, are very active.
Now, in your research, has there been any, at least that you found any conclusive evidence or sign that the infiltration or the involvement on campuses is going as far as trying to spread propaganda or anything of that sort?
Well, I did find primarily more the efforts to steal research, which I think might be more concerning. So, for example, at Duke University, I have a chapter about a graduate student from China who essentially was working on Pentagon-funded research to create an invisibility cloak to hide our weapons. And, he essentially poached this research. He arranged to have Chinese collaborators come in and photograph the equipment Duke had built. He tricked the professor into agreeing to share his research in China. He secretly started a website in China and put a lot of Duke's research on it. And, Duke eventually figured out what was going on and took away his key to the lab, but it was kind of too late, and he went back to China and started a competing institute with Duke's research and became a billionaire. So that was pretty alarming to me. Now, in terms of propaganda, I think that happens even more broadly than the kind of intelligence activity I'm talking about. We've seen it in the Russian efforts on, and we seem to be almost inundated by propaganda in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here with my co-host, Micah Jackson. Micah, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, we've talked about this kind of things as far as the influence of intelligence agencies and their involvement and American life, and obviously getting into the universities, whether it's to recruit for the next generation or to steal research or just to keep an eye on things. I guess it's part of their natural behavior that we see everywhere else, where just keeping tabs on things. But in your opinion, Micah, and then Daniel, I would like your opinion, your thoughts on this too. What is the greatest threat, I guess, of this type of activity or interference?
Well, that's a pretty profound question. I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, there's space for misinformation. There's space for pressure. I mean, I was reading one story, and I forget at this point, it was a few weeks back, actually, about Iranian scientists being pressured, basically. Just, people walking up to them and, saying, I'm with the CIA and I want you to come with me. And, that's a little bit like more overt than, you might expect. And the person is, as he pointed out, in a foreign country, so I don't know. I think that obviously everybody's going to want to know these high tech devices, the thing that Daniel mentioned about the threat of, the high tech threat is what they're all, going to justify for doing this. So it's hard to say. What could the danger be? In some ways, that is.
If I could speak to it
Please.
for a minute, that Iranian example you mentioned is from my book, and it wasn't actually overt in a certain way. And what it was about 10 years ago, when we were very concerned. This was before the Iranian nuclear agreement. We were very concerned about trying to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear bomb. So what the CIA did was they couldn't really recruit Iran. It's not easy to get to them. So they staged these fake academic conferences where around the world in Europe and places like that, and they would fund the conference secretly. So and then they would make it to be its focus of study to be an area that they knew an Iranian nuclear scientist they were interested in was his expertise. The idea was we'll try and get these Iranian nuclear scientists to defect to the U.S., and that would slow down the Iranian nuclear program. So they'd set up this conference. They'd invite the Iranian scientists, come give a speech on your specialty, nuclear fusion or whatever. And then the Iranian guy would show up with his handlers, because Iran doesn't send its scientists overseas by themselves. And the CIA would separate the scientist from his handlers, and then get him alone and approach him, maybe in his room after the conference, maybe somewhere else. And then they'd say, we're from the CIA. We want you to defect to the U.S. And and if he says, well, what happens if I don't? They would say, well, good things are not going to happen to you if you don't defect to the U.S. So there was an element of, pressure and intimidation and scaring the guy. And so it was overt in the sense they said they're from the CIA, but they used a ploy to get the guy there, and then they intimidated him.
Certainly.
And got them to the U.S. So in a way, it's a smart move. I mean, the stakes are very high, and it was important to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, but there was a bit of an ethical trade-off. But overall, I mean, I point to two dangers, right? The first is national security. I mean, from the concern about the foreign intelligence, I mean, universities do an awful lot of valuable research for the intelligence community and the Pentagon, and more every year. I mean, as other sources of revenue for universities go dry, particularly state funding, they're relying more on funding from the federal. In this case, some of this research can be pretty important that we're losing. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of research a year goes abroad. And so that's one. And then on the domestic side, I'm kind of a traditionalist, and I think academic freedom is important, and the credibility of our academics. So, if somebody goes overseas and they're a professor, but they're really working for the CIA, and they get caught, then it sort of tarnishes all our academic efforts in that country or that region. And by the same token, a university is supposed to be kind of a place of candor and integrity, and the classroom's in a way kind of a sacred spot. So if you have people in a classroom who are pretending to be one thing, but they're really intelligence agents, that affects kind of the core of the educational process. So there's all kinds of academic freedom issues and national security issues wrapped up in what I'm writing about.
Yeah, that's some really important stuff that you went through there. I have so many thoughts on it. For one, I'm just curious your thoughts on this. Like in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if universities are losing resources, losing funding, and they continue to be more and more dependent on the government for, say, to finance really important research that is valuable in a number of different ways. I always wonder and worry about the source of funding for any kind of research and how that might affect the outcome. And, if that would end up being a negative outcome in the long run of having governments funding universities, research.
And even what is being researched, the priorities being set, the same complaint, that is brought up often with large corporate donors, obviously, and you see that in underwriting of programming, where people are concerned about, how that money is shaping either research, where we should be able to discuss the ideas and such. Is the scholarly environment being manipulated because of this? Is the discussion manipulated because of this? Are they able to be a CIA agent spying and still be a professor?
Those are really good questions, because a central aspect to universities is their independence and also kind of their global nature, right? I mean, they're not exactly just national institutions. I mean, they're supposed to be for the brightest minds from around the world coming together to learn and study and teach and do research, and but this is kind of making inroads on that. I mean, in a way, the last 3-4 years, I mean, the big political issue around the world seems to have been, do we prefer globalization or do we prefer nationalism, right? So this was a big issue in the Trump campaign. He was kind of represented a backlash against globalization, and, Brexit and the French presidential election. And this, in a way, is kind of a case study of that. You've got these global institutions, these universities that are designed to sort of transcend boundaries. And then you got these intelligence agencies from the U.S. and from other countries all kind of coming in and burrowing in for their particular national agendas. And, in one sense, universities are, they're American. They owe a certain duty to the government. But in another sense, they also have a higher duty. So it becomes kind of a case study of, do we want nationalism or do we want globalization, And in that sense, it has a lot of repercussions.
Absolutely. I want to read this to you. I saw this from another article looking at the CIA involvement in education, and I'm sure you've come across this in your research, but it says in William Corson's 1977 book, The Armies of Ignorance, that he made the claim that the CIA was working with as many as 5,000 academics who recruited between 200 and 300 foreign students. As much as 60% of the college professors and staff involved in this recruiting were contract CIA employees. Does that line up with what you've found?
Well, I think those are bigger numbers than are generally accepted, in terms of the number of professors working with the CIA. But there's no doubt that some were at the time and that some still are. I mean, it's actually interesting that was written in 1977, because right around then were the key events that shaped the situation today. I mean, one of them was the Church Committee had come out the year before, and he might have been basing some of his research on that. And that was a U.S. Senate investigation of CIA abuses. And one of the things they found was that, the CIA had these contacts on different campuses, these professors. Now, I think they said 300 professors. They didn't put the kind of numbers you quoted. But it got universities very concerned. And, in fact, Harvard then adopted guidelines and said, well, no faculty or students here can undertake intelligence operations for the CIA, and they can't recruit unwitting foreign students under false pretenses. But the CIA then said, we don't care what guidelines Harvard adopted. We're not going to follow them. And hardly any other universities, borrowed those guidelines. And so the result was Harvard was kind of left alone, and the whole effort came to naught. And so, the quote you read is from the period when there was this ferment, but ultimately it failed, and it was a last significant but failed attempt to prevent CIA kind of infiltration on campus, covert activity on campus. And the other thing that happened the next year, I forget the number you just quoted of the number of foreign students, but of course, there were none from China at the time, or virtually none, because it was closed to the West. And then the next year, 1978, China opened to the West and began sending students to the U.S. And today we have more than 300,000 Chinese students. And so, globalization has just increased so much since that was written that it's a whole new picture. And China in particular, one of the reasons they sent students to the West was with the aim of catching up to us in science and technology, and it's kind of by any means possible, foul or fair. So, most of it's fair. They send, bright students here who learn how to do better research and go home and invent things and develop things and help China, improve technologically. But then there's the shortcuts, that they take, and that can be a real problem, as I mentioned, as in the Duke case. So that comes right from the 77. That's right around the time that the events happened that shaped the picture that I'm writing about.
Absolutely. And it looks like the picture that you have painted with your latest book, Spy Schools, is that we have governments basically sending students and undercover CIA employees, sometimes covertly, sometimes outright, and trying to recruit people and learn from each other, take research. Maybe some have more nefarious purposes, but it's definitely an interesting area. And I also appreciate that you mentioned the Church Committee, because the book that I mentioned, Armies of Ignorance, came out in 1977. So that was right around that time where there's a lot of revelations about the CIA and their infiltration of media, their infiltration of activist groups, and just all kinds of information. And as you said, that was really one of the last attempts to kind of curtail that, because in the last going on 50 years now, we've seen just a massive growth of intelligence agencies and the CIA. And of course, that's been really a part of the discussion in the last year or so. How do you see this, just looking forward to the future? How do you see the future between the relationship between colleges and intelligence agencies?
Well, I mean, I see intelligence agencies as becoming ever more active, probably at universities, and to my mind, that's unfortunate. But one is, that President Trump is quite, unpredictable and sometimes, belligerent in his statements. And so I think other countries, friend or foe, are, desperate probably to figure out what's going on and what he plans to do. And one of the ways they do that is by, you can't directly infiltrate the federal government as easily. So, if you get to know professors who maybe will go in or out of the government, that can be one way to gather the information. We kind of have a revolving door between academia and government. And, it's interesting in that context. I don't know if you noticed, but the Trump campaign foreign policy advisor, Papadopoulos, who just pleaded guilty, he had, connected the Trump campaign with the Putin regime, and the liaison was a professor. A London-based professor in this case. So it's interesting. The Russians are very well known to kind of see academia as a vulnerability of Western countries because academics are so close to government. So that's one reason why it might, become just expand. And another is, if you think about Iran, if we pull out of that nuclear agreement, we'll be kind of right back where we were 10 years ago, having to come up with other strategies to prevent them from becoming a nuclear power. And, we might be back setting up, fake academic conferences again. And so I think that certainly this is probably a pattern that's going to continue and just, if anything, become an even bigger issue.
Absolutely. That would be my determination as well.
And academic conferences aren't necessarily cheap either. So, I mean, it's not like the intelligence agencies are that cheap or anyone knows their budget either. And then, there's, in certain ways, I understand we're defending, these people are defending America. And then in other ways, we're really under. So, I mean, it just depends on how you view spies, I guess, and to a certain degree also.
Well, you're right, and I mean those are all good points. And as you say about the budget of the CIA covert budget, it's nobody knows it. It's classified, but it's interesting because if you look at spying from a very sort of macro bird's eye level, you could say, well, it's a good thing because countries are learning more information about each other, right? So it's a way of knowing each other's intentions. Maybe it can avert war. But on a kind of what in my book, I mean, I look at it, you know, I look at some of the collateral damage. You know, I mean, if you look at the effect on individual people, I mean, there's students, you know, who get sucked in because they're, you know, ideologically fervent and they're young and impressionable and they don't know any better. And then there's professors like the guy I mentioned at South Florida who are pressured or enticed to spy. And a lot of these people end up wounded in some way, you know. John le Carré praised my book a lot, and really that's a theme in his novels, you know, kind of the people who are, you know, used and thrown away in the course of spying. And you know, and I find that when I look at some of the people on campus who get drawn into it.
I think that's a very good point about just spying in general, an abstract point about it, that through the ages there are, you know, it is a massive use and toss operation, and it obviously that has to have some effect in academia, because I don't believe that you can have that mindset and go with that as your goal, your end, your purpose into academia, no matter if you have a PhD or not, without it affecting the work you're doing, because you're really just there to spy. You're not really there to serve the ideas as much. I don't know, you know, but it's really interesting to hear from you after seeing this more and more on the news, and we definitely appreciate how well you articulated what is going on. It's definitely a boon
Absolutely.
for our listeners, and we actually have musical guests here today that are listening as well. So, you know, I think this is what we'll have a dialogue and discussion about, you know, because it's not really clear cut on, you know, a lot of the ethics on this. You know, in some ways, like you said, it could avert a war. It could, you know, do these different good things. But at the same time, it has the person's hands anyway. So if someone wanted to know more about this, I'm sure they could read your book. But what else might they be able to do?
Well, I would say certainly, yeah. I'd encourage people to read my book, and I just say about it that, you know, I try and at least bring these things to light so they can be matters of discussion, and to have it read, you know, like a thriller, like a fun read with these stories of individual people. Just, you know, it's true and it's factual. So I'd say that would be the great appeal there. And then, you know, there's really hardly anything written on this topic. I mean, obviously in England there's a lot more attention over the years to the interplay of academia and espionage because of, you know, the Cambridge Five and Kim Philby and those people from Cambridge University who were major Soviet spies in the 40s and 50s. But here there really hasn't been a good book since one called Cloak and Gown in the 70s by a Yale University librarian who I think had also worked for the CIA at times. His name was Robin Winks, and that's the last sort of full-length treatment of it. You know, it's funny, you'll read these CIA memoirs, you know, by former CIA intelligence officers, and they'll be, you know, 300-page book, and in it there'll just be a page or two about how they went to this academic conference and recruited somebody, or how they dropped by this university. And it's funny, it seems to be a part of all their experience, but nobody had ever sort of pulled it out and thought about it and said, you know, boy, this seems to be going on in such a widespread way. So, you know, so I think, you know, those who are interested could read my book, could go back and get, you know, Cloak and Gown out of the library and see what that had to say about the earlier years of the CIA, and, you know, look at some of the CIA memoirs that mention academia. There's one called The Reluctant Spy by John Kiriakou that has a pretty interesting story of how he was recruited out of George Washington University. So, you know, those would be some of the things I'd suggest.
Those are great leads. I really appreciate them personally.
Absolutely. And we really appreciate your time, Daniel, talking with us today. The book, once again, is Spy Schools, How the CIA, FBI, and Foreign Intelligence Secretly Exploit America's Universities. It's on Amazon. I believe there's an ebook as well. And, yeah, I definitely recommend checking it out. And some of those recommendations that you made are very much appreciated. We look forward to talking with you again in the future. And I plan to read the book. I've only got the ebook now, so we haven't had a chance to dive in, so this is a good introduction, but I look forward to learning more, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and then let me know what you think once you've read it. I'd be interested to hear your opinion.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Thanks.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
You too, bye.
That was Daniel Golden, who is a senior editor at ProPublica, and also he is a researcher and author of this book and another book before it, but he's done a few different things, and I'd check him out.